Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by Real Good Foods. Real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and this is one of our extra episodes. Throughout 2019, I'm taking the last episode of every month and making it kind of a longer interview. We take an excerpt and put that in the regular episode. And then in this kind of bonus episode, you hear the full interview. And these have been a deep dive on one aspect of diabetes management. So if this is the first one you're hearing, consider a trip over to diabetes-connections.com or any podcast app. And you can search for the word extra or just go through the last year and you'll see episodes on everything from low blood sugar. I mean, the basics. What is it? How do you treat it? What's happening in your body? To what is insulin? We go through all the different types and what they do. We looked at insulin pumps. We've looked at CGMs. So a lot of really good information. And all of these episodes are transcribed. And those transcriptions are free. You get them when you sign up for the Diabetes Connections newsletter. When you head to the website, the sign up should pop up. And then once you are subscribed, you immediately get that month's transcription. And then it will continue month by month after that. The subject this month is mental health. We wanted to take a deep dive into this, burnout, depression, feeling like a burden to other people. So my guest was diagnosed herself with type 1 at age 8. She is a licensed therapist. In fact, her social media handle is the Diabetic Therapist, and she's a CDE in training. Allison Nimlos is going to talk about the mental toll diabetes can take. She knows all about this firsthand. And really what you can do about it. Strategies for talking to your loved one with type 1, if you're not the person with diabetes yourself, or if you are an adult with type 1. Allison has some great strategies she shared for kind of turning the equation around and thinking of this in a different way. So I hope you'll learn something from it. I really enjoyed talking with her. And here is the full interview with Allison Nimlos. Allison, thanks for being with me. I'm really interested to kind of see where this conversation goes. Thanks for making the time.
I am so happy to be here.
All right, before we jump in, and there are so many questions to ask, this is a very broad topic, and I want to get to your diabetes story as well. But what made you want to go into this field? Why become a therapist? Why focus on mental health?
So that's a great question. So when I was kind of going through my quarter life crisis back in my mid-20s, was trying to figure out what I really wanted to be when I grew up, I thought I wanted to be a diabetes educator. It was something that I had actually thought about on and off for many, many years. I actually even remember telling my dad when I was like 12 that I wanted to be a diabetes educater. And it sort of waxed and waned in my interest over the years. And I had been writing for Diabetes Mind for a couple of years, and I had really enjoyed being able to teach people about diabetes. And so I thought I wanted to be an educator and work with people on a one-on-one basis, not just write an article and hope it made an impact for somebody, because you just sort of put things up and you hope somebody resonates with it. You don't really know where it's going to go. I wanted to have more of that personal interaction with people. And so I had started pursuing prerequisites for, nursing or dietetics, kind of that normal, kind of the traditional normal path to becoming a diabetes educator. And as I was doing it, I realized it wasn't really speaking to why I wanted to be a diabetes educator, sort of just helping people learn to check their blood sugar, helping people, eat healthy. I wanted to help people really live and cope and thrive with diabetes, which I think motivates a lot of people who are in kind of the advocacy field anyways, which I had been doing for quite a while, just wanting to really inspire people and move people to have hope and feel like they can do anything. And so taking a look at kind of my core reasons, my why for why I wanted to be an educator, I started asking around with some other therapists that I knew who also worked with people with diabetes. And I said, this is kind of what I'm thinking about doing. And this is kind of why I want to do it. And they were really supportive. They thought, that could really make, a big impact. And it was right around the time where there was a lot of studies coming out about the psychosocial impact of diabetes and the mental health side of diabetes. It was just becoming more and more of the conversation at a lot of the large conferences, and research studies were coming out. And so it really just seemed like everybody was just starting to get it. I mean, it had always been a thing. It had always been an issue. I mean, mental health and diabetes has always been linked, but it was finally becoming a real big part of the conversation. And I thought, I think this is where I needed. And now, especially being a practicing therapist, so many people do say that how much they wish they had a therapist with diabetes, how much the life with diabetes, the shots or wearing an insulin pump or the 24/7-ness of diabetes, the impact on relationships, how much it really shapes who they are and how they wish they had somebody that they could talk to about that. I'm just seeing more and more evidence that this specialization is really needed, and I'm really excited to be a part of that. I wish there were more of me. I think there's like 12 of us, right? I mean, there's more than 12, but there are not a lot of therapists with diabetes, and there's not a lot of therapists who really specialize also in diabetes. They may have it, but it might not be something that they're super vocal about working with as a real specialty. I am still pursuing my CDE. I'm just going the very long route. I'm going through the unique qualifications pathway, which is much longer, but I do also want to be an educator. I want to do both because I really think that that's what people need. They need the education and they need the mental health support, and you can't separate them. They're inextricably linked in the life of someone with diabetes.
Sure. Well, and let's talk about that, because I think that the biggest topic that seems to come up, the most obvious one for people who talk about trying to find a therapist or needing help with diabetes, it seems to be what everybody kind of refers to as burnout. Is it really burnout? I mean, where does somebody start if they think, I just don't want to do this another day?
Well, nobody really wants to do it another day. So it's really quite prevalent. Bill Polanski and Larry Fisher, they're out in California, have really spearheaded the research in this area. And so I've read a lot of their research and have met with them and talked with them about this. And from my perspective, I kind of take, maybe a unique or kind of sort of put my own stamp on the topic, in that I really see two things show up for people, or maybe even like a spectrum of things that show up for people in both the clients that I have worked with and also when I do speaking and just meet with people out in the community. There are two words that get thrown around, and that's diabetes distress and diabetes burnout. And if you read the research, if you read articles online, you'll see them used somewhat interchangeably, that they kind of mean the same thing, and it goes from everywhere from, having just this frustration or anger or fatigue with living with diabetes, all the way to not actually managing diabetes anymore. And that can look like a lot of things too. I mean, that can be anywhere from not taking insulin as needed, or not testing blood sugar, or not wearing CGM, or ignoring the alarms. I mean, it looks like a lot. I mean, there is such a spectrum of how this shows up for people. So it's very individual. And I think that's one thing that I think people need to keep in mind, is just like your other mental health issues, anxiety and depression, those things can show up differently for different people. What symptoms people have, the root cause of anxiety is going to be different for everyone. So I think the same idea can apply to those dealing with diabetes burnout or diabetes distress. And so I've sort of put things into two buckets. When I give my talks, I talk about diabetes distress and diabetes burnout as kind of being their own things. Distress being more of the day-to-day emotional burden of living with diabetes, just being really frustrated with the roller coaster, maybe feeling angry that you are having to take time away from family or a social event, maybe feeling guilty or shame over the blood sugar reading that you're getting. And then if that persists, it can really lead to people really pushing away from their care, because it becomes so distressing that you have to say, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I'm not going to, and people don't necessarily think that like consciously that they're like, I'm just not going to take care of myself. Most of the time, it's a very subconscious reaction to what's going on that they just delay, like, they kind of, I'll bolus later, or, I'll check in a little bit. Like, I just don't want to do this right now. And so it starts showing up in their health behaviors. It starts showing up in, are they pre-bolusing? Are they testing? Are they doing all of these things? And so, and then at the end of the day, 3-6 months later, they go in for their A1C and it's elevated from where it had been. And everyone's going, what happened? And it's really been this like slow progression that is really kind of insidious, that, you may not even know it because it just builds so gradually that you get to this point. And I think a lot of people, it is normal. Diabetes distress affects like half of people with diabetes at any given point. Like, it affects everybody basically. But a lot of times I think people think that there's just nothing that you can do about it. Like, this is just diabetes. And so there can be kind of a hopelessness with resolving it in any meaningful way.
Well, I guess my question would be then, what do you do, right? How do you even recognize it's happening? And then once you see it, if it were as easy as, I just need to get back on track, right? Everybody would do it.
First of all, there needs to be a greater awareness among, I think, our healthcare providers for recognizing distress and burnout. I think that is a big conversation topic that is missing when we go in for our appointments. I can't recall a time when I've had an endocrinologist or a nurse practitioner ask me, how am I doing mentally with this balancing life and diabetes? Sometimes it can be validating as far as my A1C, goes up a little bit. Oh, well, you're a new mom and that sort of thing. Like, they can sometimes just sort of recognize that this is a transition point in my life. But as far as actually doing any kind of assessment or really having that conversation of educating people that like distress and burnout are real things that people with diabetes experience. I think if more people had the language to describe what they're going through and to know kind of ahead of time, this is something that could happen. This is something that's likely to happen because of the nature of the disease. I think people would be much more readily able to reflect on their experience and then say, hey, I think that is what I'm going through. I need to reach out to either my healthcare provider or I need to reach out to a therapist or a psychologist because this is something that needs to be taken care of so that it doesn't negatively impact my emotional well-being and my physical well-being.
One thing that interests me as the parent of a child with type 1 is that I often have gotten comments from very well-meaning friends who say things like, well, it's great that he's so used to it. It'll always just be part of his life. He's fine. He'll grow up and he'll be used to it. And I worry a lot about Benny certainly, who's 14 now, but about adults with type 1 who've lived with it either since childhood or were diagnosed as adults. And there just seems to be this perception that, they're over it. They got it. But that's not the case, right? You can have the diabetes distress and burnout at any age.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it doesn't just go away if it's not taken care of, if it's not addressed. It's not really going to just fade. Research shows how persistent it can be if it's not really tackled head on. And I think it can kind of wax and wane a little bit, but it's pretty persistent as far as what they're seeing through, interviewing people. And yeah, I think going back to what you're saying about growing up with type 1 diabetes, I think that there is this idea that it becomes normal or it's not a big deal anymore. And the truth is that diabetes changes the way that, going through puberty, it changes, physiologically, there's changes, but then relationally, when you get older, going into college, like your entire social structure changes. Your parents aren't there anymore and you're on your own for everything. So not only are you having to worry about paying rent and paying bills, but you're also having to remember to go to the pharmacy and learn how to check your insurance benefits and all these things. And it is, more kind of to-dos. And then you have a whole new set of people that you're introducing your diabetes to. If you've grown up, then you might almost forget that you have to introduce it to people because you've gone through elementary and middle and high school. At least that's what it was for me. Everyone knew by the time I graduated from high school that I had diabetes. I didn't even have to introduce it anymore. But then you go to college once I graduated from college, I moved across the country. So again, the whole transition and the whole, kind of upheaval of your life happens, especially in your 20s, fairly regularly as you're kind of establishing yourself and establishing like your own circle of, new friends in your work and romantic relationships and your own children. And so it keeps going. And so diabetes continues to evolve, not so much in that, the disease is changing, but the way that it kind of shows up and impacts your life changes. And those things can be stress points for people. And if you're not getting support to kind of go through all of that, it's really hard. And it can sometimes feel like you're being diagnosed all over again because you're going through these changes.
I know one of your specialties is that path to independence, that transitional time from teenage to college to, living on your own. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I love it. I love talking to parents, whether I'm coaching them or, doing family counseling. I think it's such an important topic because, again, I think up until recently, there weren't a lot of structures in place to help teenagers and parents navigate that very unique transition, because taking ownership of diabetes is much different than taking ownership of your homework. There are different consequences to that. Or, starting to do like your own laundry is different than ordering your own diabetes supplies or learning how to change your own basal rates and things like that. So I think families need a lot of support and education as far as like what to look for, because this is not something that is going to show up in like Parent Magazine. As far as like how to guide your kids to independent management is not going to be an article in Good Housekeeping. So.
Well, and let's just jump in and answer some of those questions if you don't mind. So what are some things that parents should be doing and can do to help out with this transition?
Well, I think that's such a big question. I think there's two things that immediately come to mind as far as the questions that I get most often is when to start and what to allow kids to start doing. And so I kind of say, start early and go slowly, that you can start asking and kind of gauging interest and maturity level as early as like 10, 11, 12 years old. But you need to obviously give over full control much, much slower than you would other tasks, just because of the seriousness of the tasks that you're giving over. And I think that's where a lot of parents can, they don't do it intentionally, but I think that's where parents and teens can find themselves getting into a lot of that kind of the DKA scares and things like that, in that teens, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, maybe want to because they want their parents to stop asking them about their diabetes. They're like, yeah, I'll just do it. I know how to do this. I've been doing this since I was 6. This is easy. And then they do it, and then they kind of go through their own burnout distress because there's a lot going on when you're a teenager, and they can have a hard time with the management and kind of the forethought and the reactivity that diabetes requires when they're also balancing peer pressure and liking a guy or a girl, whatever, there's a lot of distractions when you're a teen, wanting to impress somebody, focusing on your sports. And it's not that they won't ever be able to do it, but their brain development just isn't there yet to be able to kind of cope with everything. That's why you see kids who struggle with like remembering to bring their homework or remembering to bring their lunch or their instrument. Like kids are always forgetting things. When you forget things related to diabetes, though, that's a lot more serious than forgetting your English essay. So it's not that parents should completely hold on to everything and say, no, you're not allowed to. I'm going to do everything, because that also sets the kid up for not developing the skills at all. But it's this real dance of giving a little, but watching and communicating and assessing your kid, because your kid is going to be very different than someone else's kid as far as their readiness, their maturity, their brain development, even what the devices that they're using are going to require different skills, different management. Start early, of introducing kids to concepts and demonstrating and showing them this is how you call the pharmacy. This is what you say. Like, I'm not expecting you right now to go and do this on your own, but I want you to be watching. Just like I'm going to demonstrate other things that they have to learn. You demonstrate first, and then you let them try it out while you're watching. And then eventually you watch a little bit less as time goes on until they're, either 18 or 20 or 22. I don't think there's necessarily like a complete cutoff. In fact, I actually advocate against that. I think that part of burnout is that abandonment that adults feel like, I have to do absolutely everything for diabetes completely on my own, and I am tired of it. I'm not necessarily in favor of a complete, especially not all in one get-go, I think it needs to be done really carefully, really slowly, and it needs to be done kind of on the terms of the individual with diabetes, and they may want more or less support than someone else. And I think that's great. I think that flexibility is really needed to match the personality of each person.
How hard is it for an adult to reach out and ask for help? Somebody, like yourself, very capable. You're a mom of a toddler. You're working. You're busy. And I imagine you're not running around saying, I really need more help, even if you might. I mean, it's hard to ask for help without diabetes. How do you talk to people about, saying, you can't do this all on your own. It's okay to share the burden. It's got to be difficult.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's a piece of self-talk that I work with a lot of my, counseling and coaching clients all together, is this idea of being a burden. It's a prevalent narrative, I think, as you grow up, is you're a lot of work. I think because we see it, it's like we think it's a lot of work. And why would anybody want to do this? Or I don't want to give this over to somebody else. I've met so many young adults who are worried about getting into a romantic relationship because they're worried about the burden of diabetes. So I think for me, it was a lot of, I don't know if there was necessarily a moment in time where I became like a revelation. I don't think it was like a light bulb moment, but I think just evolving to the point where you could see how reaching out to those who are particularly close to you. So you don't necessarily need to feel like I'm going to just ask strangers or anything like that. I think starting with those who are closest to you, because those are relationships where as humans, we want to help ease the burden of those that we love. I often ask my clients to think of it in reverse. Like if your spouse or your best friend or your brother was going through diabetes or just going through something really hard where they felt burdened, would you want to help them? And of course the answer is like, of course I would want to help. I love them. And it's like, that's what love is. Love is wanting to help ease the burden that somebody is experiencing. And so if you are secure and confident in that relationship, then that is an interaction that you can really invest in. And I think being able to see how the sharing of burden really can actually enhance the intimacy and closeness of a relationship, it makes me more open to, inviting my husband to get me a juice box or to tell him what my A1C is, because I know if I'm excited about something, he's going to be excited about it. And I know he wants to be in on it so that he understands what my experience is and can be emotionally supportive, or vice versa. If my A1C goes the other direction and I'm sad about it, he wants to be able to comfort me, because that's why he's there, right? Like that's why you get in these relationships, is to be able to be supportive. And so understanding that diabetes is just like that, that for me is something that has helped as a mom and as a wife and friend and daughter, having that relationship and knowing that that's why they're there. That's the purpose of those relationships. It's not just to have a good time, but it's really to be able to be a support for each other. And this is one of the areas where we most need support. And our experience will show that. I mean, there's research to show it, but you don't need research to know that you need support with diabetes.
Right. Let's back up. We're well into this interview, Allison, but I didn't ask you about your own diagnosis story. You were diagnosed as a kid. We've mentioned that you live with type 1. How old were you? What do you remember about it?
I was 8. I was 8 years old. So I did like the whole teenage years. I remember what that was like. And, done college, with diabetes. And, I got married just before I turned 26. And now I have a 2-year-old. So I've done a number of the life stages now. I'm going on 26 years with type 1 diabetes. Yeah, it's definitely been, interesting. And like I said, each stage, diabetes just looks a little bit different. So my own distress and burnout have come and they've gone, and they've come and they've gone again.
You're in a very different place now as a parent with type 1 of a child who doesn't have type 1. And that's a very different experience. And I know this isn't a whole episode about that, but has anything kind of surprised you in the last 2 years? We focus a lot about pregnancy, but we don't talk too much about being a mom.
Yeah, I know. It's like once you have the baby, everything's supposed to be easy, and it's not actually. I mean, I would say that's right when the burnout. That was my last kind of burnout happened right after I had him, because I was in such a period of such intense care, and then there was this huge transition of becoming a parent, not sleeping as much, and having to he didn't have health issues, but we had trouble nursing, and he had a tongue tie, so feeding. So there was so much attention on him that I didn't even notice how I wasn't. Oh, and I started a new job. I had a baby and started a job within 8 weeks. So I didn't notice it. It was just like I talk about. It was like, I don't have time for this. This is so much work. I'll do it later. I'll correct later. It's not that bad. 220 was just kind of like, well, I'm not 300. Right. Your whole narrative about it kind of changes and adjusts. And for me, it wasn't so much that I just suddenly said, like, I hated diabetes, I'm going to stop doing it. But it stopped being such a priority. It is so much work. And I had so much other work going on. I had to just kind of push it a little bit. And I hear that from a lot of people. They're like, it doesn't have that sense of urgency. Keeping the baby alive felt a lot more urgent. So, and when I got my A1C down, and it jumped like 1.5%. And I was like, okay, yeah, I think I'm in it. And so, having to regroup was a big turning point, and just needing to really vocalize my needs as far as this is what I think we need to start buying as far as food goes, just, making some shifts in nutrition, not eating as many processed carbs, which are super easy because you just want to throw everything into the microwave. Mm-hmm. But it was just like, we need to just kind of regroup here and kind of think about how we want to do things differently.
I'm curious, too, when you have a moment like that in your life, which is a prime example of how difficult diabetes can be, was it difficult for you to not be angry with yourself? To kind of forgive yourself and say, I needed that time. Like, I needed to get through that time. It's okay that my A1C went up. My baby was the priority, and I'm getting back into it. Was it hard for you to do that for yourself, though? Yeah, I think just like anyone, I think there's always that moment, kind of that cringe, that like, oh, man, like, that's not so good. It's easier now. I think I've had a lot more practice being sort of mindfully detached from the numbers, that when I either see a blood sugar reading or I get an A1C, to know, like, this is a moment in time. This isn't forever. And to know that an A1C that, at that level is not going to make or break my long-term health. It's important to respond, but it is also equally important not to be too reactive, like emotionally. I've done a lot of my own work around being able to see numbers as just data. And it's hard sometimes, especially when you are putting a lot of effort into it. There are those times of being frustrated. And I think that's normal. I think there's also an encouragement I want to leave people with to, one, not over pathologize like your own emotional reaction. Like, that's also normal. Not everything has to be rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. That if you're upset that you're 272, like, you can be upset that you're 272. Like, that's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with being upset about a number, but it's, where is that going to go? Are you going to stay upset? Are you going to let that number, ruin your whole day or your whole week? Are you going to sort of throw an adult temper tantrum and just say, like, I'm going to skip the party and I'm not going to go out with my friends? And like, because that's just going to make you more miserable. That just snowballs the emotion. That doesn't resolve the emotion. It's okay to be unhappy or dissatisfied with a result, but it's also equally important to say, like, okay, now what am I going to do that's going to help me, rather than just
either giving up and just saying like, well, I'm just such a screw up. I'm not going to get this right, or it's not worth it, or I keep trying. It's like, why even bother? I mean, because those feel the wrong behaviors. They're not going to improve things. They're not going to get you where you want to go. So it's important to be really mindful of like the story you're telling yourself when you're seeing these numbers. It's okay to have those emotions, but where are those emotions taking you?
So a question that I wonder about, and I think you're a good person to ask because you've had diabetes since before a lot of the technology that is around now. And many people, really people outside the community, is, oh, the technology must make your life so much easier, or, wow, this is so great, now you can do that. And it certainly has improved lives in many ways. But I'm curious, I sense that CGM data in particular stresses people out. And I don't even mean the people with diabetes. I mean the caregivers, the partners. Can you talk just a little bit about how do you navigate seeing all of the information? And I guess we'll break it up into two parts here for the person with diabetes, because it's so helpful for so many people. But at the same time, it causes a lot of stress in people who kind of, get anxious. So let's start there if we could.
Yeah. A little known secret of me is when I was pregnant, I stopped using my CGM because of that, which most people would be like, that's the time to use it, right? And it was counterproductive for my mental health. And I had a hard time not being reactive to the numbers. It forced me to really slow down. It was a lot of extra work because I tested probably 10, 12 times a day. It was a lot of test strips, but I would test every 2 hours and I would only respond to the blood sugar that was there every 2 hours, because what I was doing was I was rage bolusing when I would see like a 160, and then I hit 30 like 5 times in my first trimester. And I was just like, this is kind of driving me a little bit nuts. I need to step back. And so, yeah, to your point, I think taking breaks from technology, taking breaks from our own expectations of what kind of time in range or blood sugar average we need to have all the time can actually really help. Bill Polanski calls them like diabetes vacations. You just take very short, very purposeful, intentional, and planned breaks from whatever it is that you normally do, just to kind of release some of that anxiety. And not that you stop taking insulin or the kinds of things that you really need to do to stay healthy. So if you're going to take a break from your CGM, you might want to test your blood sugar a couple extra times just to kind of balance that out. But then there's not that alarm fatigue or anxiety about what the arrows are telling you. So there's different ways to kind of manage that, and it's very individual as far as what is going to be most successful. For some people, it's more helpful just to turn the alarms off. You can still have the CGM data, or you can switch from a Dexcom to a Libre so that you're still getting aspects that you find really beneficial, but you're sort of changing up some of what is irritating you and stressing you out. That's something that I recommend to people to be at least self-reflective about. And then I think with caregivers and adults alike, I think part of the anxiety too is just a lot of what we have been told about the numbers. There's just a conversation about what these numbers mean, what they're going to do to you. There's a lot of scare tactics that healthcare providers will give to parents and that parents will give to kids and that kids grow up with. And then they hold on to that of like, this is what that number means. There can be feelings of failing, of shame, of inadequacy in everyone, parents and the T1s themselves. And so that's something to really pay attention to. And I hope that's something that our healthcare providers will start paying attention to as well, because they have such an influence in how we see diabetes and how we interact with it. They are our first teachers with this disease, and they really need to lead by example, and their conversations with us, and then so on and so forth, parents with their children, adults with their spouse or their friends, these conversations spread, and they're the education and they're the story of what an existence with diabetes is like. And so we have to really pay attention to what that story is, because it carries on.
Well, Allison, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, for this really valuable information. I really enjoyed talking with you. And before I let you go, just real quick, tell me a little bit about your little boy.
His name's Henrik.
And is he learning more about your devices and anything diabetes related?
He is. All juice boxes are Mama's juice box. That's what we bought. We were at the grocery store yesterday and he saw it and he goes, Mama's juice box. And so they're mine, and, he knows PDM, his Mama's PDM, although sometimes he thinks it's a phone. He'll also say Mama's phone because it looks like a phone. So he's getting kind of into some of the language, but he doesn't, as far as identifying objects, but he doesn't really know diabetes quite yet. Just that Mama drinks juice boxes sometimes. And then he'll drink them when they're not empty. He'll pretend to drink out of them. God. So it's pretty funny.
That is great. Well, thanks so much for spending so much time with me. I appreciate it.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Thanks again to Allison for sharing her story and sharing her advice. Lots of links and information in the show notes. We do that for every episode. And all of the show notes, if you can't find them on a podcast app, if you're listening that way or through social media, you can always head over to diabetes-connections.com. Every episode has its own page and its own show notes are right there. I've really enjoyed doing these extra episodes. We shall see if we continue them in 2020. I have some other ideas for it, but there will be one more extra this year in November, but not in December. And we will pick it up in January. We are making some changes to the podcast in 2020. Nothing drastic, and it's probably a little soon to start mentioning it. But man, we are closing in on the last couple of months, couple of weeks of the year. Hard to believe. Oh, my goodness. All right. Well, thank you, as always, for joining me. Thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here on Tuesday.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.